Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing a free agent update for the San Jose Sharks. These last couple of days have been very exciting with the draft going on, but at the same time, there have been some leaks about the future of some of the restricted free agents on the San Jose Sharks, but nothing had really been confirmed until today, which was the official deadline league-wide of issuing qualifying offers to teams' restricted free agents. So now we know which players will likely be back for the Sharks next season, which ones have been let go, and which ones have just already been given a contract. And we start off in that list with forward Luke Kunin. 1 year, $2.75 million. During my free agency preview, I'd already resigned myself to the fact that Luke Kunin would likely be back on the team just because the organization seemed to be a pretty big fan of his. But once the Sharks had gone out and they picked up Afanasyev and Grundstrom to also support players like Goodrow and Dellandrea, it felt as though that Luke Kunin's spot on the roster had essentially been squeezed out, had been lost. And so I had begun to think that maybe they wouldn't actually re-sign him. But now with this news that he is indeed going to be back, I worry that he will, like last year, get pretty much the entire season of playing time. Last year it didn't matter that much since the Sharks had a lack of a better option, but going into this next season, the Sharks have not only bolstered their bottom six with players who are actually good in that role, but have also brought in high level of rookie talent like Will Smith and probably like Macklin Celebrini, who Kunin would potentially be taking lineup spots from. And the thing is that one could normally argue with a player, well, I'm sure if they play poorly, they'll be brought out of the lineup. But the fact is that Kunin's baseline level of play is already bad, and it is hard to imagine that he's going to be able to come down even lower than that. His offensive style of play is barely better than a fourth liner, if it is even at that level. His defensive play, while is somewhat highly rated, is actually quite bad. And if you take a look at the analytics, he was one of the worst defensive players on the San Jose Sharks this past season. And his penalty killing, where he is supposed to be a bit of a specialist, he was also one of the Sharks' worst penalty killing forwards this past season. So he's already sort of at a rock bottom, and it's hard to imagine he can fall any lower than that. And when you take a look at the quotes given by Sharks' new head coach Ryan Warsofsky, he doesn't seem to care, and he seems to be a big fan of Luke Kunin, going so far as to say that he wishes the Sharks had more players like him, which is maybe a reason for why Goodrow was picked up for free off of waivers from the New York Rangers. And Goodrow is basically just a Kunin type of player, but slightly better in that role. And so now Kunin does seem like he's going to be taking up a spot in the Sharks' top 12, and even without considering him, it was difficult to organize a top 12 for San Jose that included every single one of the players who does deserve to be at the NHL level. And with Kunin, who doesn't really deserve that, getting a spot there, someone is going to be the odd man out, which is just simply a sad thought. And an even sadder thought, and what we saw happen last season, and what will inevitably happen this year as well, is that with Luke Kunin in the lineup, there will come a time where Luke Kunin ends up on a line with a player like Will Smith or a player like Macklin Celebrini, and it'll essentially be like attaching cinder blocks to the Sharks' future stars, which is just not going to be a fun time. But in slightly brighter news, the other contract that the San Jose Sharks have announced today is Justin Bailey. He was not a restricted free agent. He was actually an unrestricted free agent, but I guess he enjoyed his time enough with the San Jose Sharks to sign this contract. 1 year, $775,000, but I'm not nearly as worried about this deal as I am about Kunin, primarily due to the fact that this is a two-way deal, which means the Sharks have the freedom to send him down to the Barracuda, bring him back up, send him down as much as they really want to. And so this feels more so like you're a depth forward in case that there are multiple injuries on the San Jose Sharks, and that the Sharks are going to be perfectly comfortable with having Bailey play a decent amount of time with the Barracuda. But also on top of that, Bailey was actually pretty decent this past season for San Jose, playing throughout the third and fourth lines, probably a better player than Luke Kunin, making a significantly less amount of money. So him being brought back in the exact contract detail that he got, actually a decent move for San Jose. Then we move on to the players who have been let go. These have not been given qualifying offers, so they will become unrestricted free agents at this point. Technically, the Sharks could bring them back, but really there's no reason to. And we start off with Jack Studnicka, really a failed experiment from this past season. I understand where Mike Grier was coming from. He saw that the Sharks were not only losing a bunch of games, but that the fashion that they were losing those games was rather embarrassing. So he wanted a player with a high compete level to come in and try try and, set a decent example, which technically Studnicka does have, but the problem is that he's just not simply good enough to be playing at the NHL level, even on a team as bad as the San Jose Sharks. So they gave him an opportunity immediately at the start. They let him get adjusted to the team, but after a stretch of a few games, he was sent back down to the Barracuda. Oddly enough, the Sharks did bring him back up over the last couple of weeks of the season. I thought over that time it would have been much more smarter to bring up a player like Kunin and give him some time in the NHL. They did eventually, but probably could have given him more games. Or someone like Ethan Cardwell, who had put up a really strong rookie season with the Barracuda, one of the best scoring rookies in the entire AHL that past season. He could have been given a first career NHL game as a reward for that, but for whatever reason, I don't know if maybe Mike Grier was trying to see if he can get his investment back, because he paid a 6th round pick for Studnicka in the first place, but he did very little of anything at all, no points over the entirety of the season he played. So I don't think anyone's going to be shedding a tear by the fact that Studnicka's not being brought back. The next player is Calen Addison, not given a qualifying offer. He was also a bit of a failed experiment by Mike Grier, trying to fill in a need that the Sharks had last season, which was a complete lack of offensive defensemen. But since Mike Grier was not willing to actually pay a high price, which is a good thing, you're only going to get what you paid for, and Calen Addison is exactly that. He brought pretty much zero offense to the team. He put up like a few points here or there, I guess, but he was never actually a dominant offensive force or even like a decent offensive force for the San Jose Sharks. And defensively, he was just really, really bad as well. Didn't really have the size to compete, and so didn't actually find much of a role on the Sharks. And while he did get a ton of games, it felt as though each and every one of them almost was quite bad. So again, don't think anyone's really shedding a tear for this loss. Then we do have Filip Zadina. Now, this is probably the one that is the saddest of the news here. Filip Zadina was another technically failed experiment by Mike Grier of this past season, trying to get him a change of scenery after he had mutually agreed to terminate his contract with the Detroit Red Wings. A first round pick in the past, a high overall first round pick in the past, who just never quite captured that potential. The Sharks maybe thought that he would be able to do so in San Jose, being given a larger role. And while he did have stints on the Sharks top 6 with some pretty decent players, it never really stuck. Mostly played in the bottom 6. And while he was okay, he even had like a 4-point night at some point this past season, it never really was all that great. And like I mentioned with Luke Kunin, with the additions of Dellandrea, Goodrow, Grundstrom, Afanasyev, Zadina's potential spot in the lineup just got squeezed out, and as such, Sharks not bringing him back. It's a bit sad to say it's not as much of an easy choice as it was with Studnicka and Addison, but it's about time that this has now happened. And then finally, the last player, Jacob Peterson. This is probably it's one that you didn't really think of, because Peterson never actually played with the San Jose Sharks this past season in the NHL. But it is kind of sad to look back on that really short stint he had at the end of a couple of seasons ago, where he was really, really impressive, and then to see him fall off a cliff completely and not even factor into a pretty weak NHL Sharks squad this past season is a bit weird, but here it is, not being brought back, not a surprise. Then we get to the qualifying offers. So these are the players who the Sharks did want to retain. It doesn't necessarily mean that these players are going to end up accepting those qualifying offers. The Sharks could sort of negotiate with them on the side. This is just so that they can keep their rights as restricted free agents alive while they do get to those negotiations. And so the first one on this list is Thomas Bordeleau. I was actually slightly worried that Mike Grier wouldn't bring back Bordeleau. It wouldn't be the first time that he'd abandon a younger player, smaller type of player who he doesn't really feel like fits the San Jose Sharks Mike Grier mold. But luckily for us, he is being given at least one more chance. I thought in the stint of games that he had at the end of this past season, he was actually one of the Sharks' better forwards. I mentioned already, many of the players that the Sharks are adding to their lineup this season will be cutting off spots from particular players. I do sincerely hope Bordeleau is not one of those guys. He should be on the roster unless his preseason is completely terrible. He should be on the roster by game 1 to at least be shown a chance of what he can do, especially if he ends up playing with some better players, because he was already showing off a relatively high level of play when in a lineup with like Nico Sturm or Luke Kunin, who really aren't the best of the best players in the NHL. So if he could find himself on a line with a Logan Couture, if he plays, or a Macklin Celebrini or a Will Smith, we might actually be able to see Thomas Bordeleau shine even more. And I do think he is ready for some at least partial full-time NHL play, and this is the first step towards that. Then we have Henry Thrun. Again, no surprises here. He played a large chunk of this past season. The team, even though it was a relatively up and down year, seems to be relatively happy with what Thrun would bring, and so it is absolutely no surprise that he would be given a qualifying offer. I suspect that he will get some sort of deal. I don't know if it'll be 1 year, 2 year, what the dollar value might end up being, but he will be a top 6 defenseman for the San Jose Sharks almost for sure, unless something crazy ends up happening. Then we get to Ty Emberson. I wasn't sure if the Sharks would be willing to bring back Emberson. This might be a move that has him play in the AHL, perhaps, because there doesn't seem to be a ton of space for Emberson on the Sharks main roster, but I liked him as a player. He was quite good in the short-ish stint that he had with the Sharks due to injuries. If he can actually remain healthy, he can be a useful piece in the Sharks top 6, again, if they can actually find room for him, but this is another fine and smart choice from Mike Grier. Then we move on to Ty Dellandrea. It makes sense. The Sharks specifically targeted him in a trade with the Dallas Stars. He is a very solid bottom 6 player who already played a decent chunk of games with a really elite Dallas Stars squad, so considering the fact that the Sharks roster is expected to be much worse than what Dallas was last year, he's definitely going to be able to find a home in the bottom 6, and hopefully he puts up a solid performance. Then we get to Afanasyev, picked up in the Ozzy Weisblatt trade with the Nashville Predators, and that seemed to be a very, very lopsided deal, but it seemed as though the case was that Afanasyev wanted to get some NHL time next season, and the Nashville Predators weren't really willing to offer that. We shall see if the Sharks are going to be able to supply that to Afanasyev. As I said, competition for lineup spots are going to be very, very high for this upcoming season. Can Afanasyev outperform others to actually earn a spot in the main NHL roster? I guess we shall see, but Mike Grier is giving him the chance to do so with this qualifying offer. And then we get to Carl Grundstrom, involved in the player-for-player swap of Kyle Burroughs from the Los Angeles Kings here. I was not 100% sure if the Sharks would actually end up giving him a qualifying offer. I thought there was a chance that this was just a move in which to get rid of Kyle Burroughs' contract, and since the Sharks already have a high level of competition for their forward slots, that Grundstrom would just add another name to the pile and wasn't 100% a necessity. But I can't say that I hate this move either. Grundstrom, like with Dellandrea, was on a very competitive Los Angeles Kings team, not quite at the Dallas Stars level, but still pretty good, and put up some really solid numbers in a bottom 6 role, something that the Sharks had lacked last season, like they lacked in pretty much every single area. So he can certainly help shore up the Sharks bottom 6 like Dellandrea did, so I don't hate this move either. And then there is Brandon Coe, was an AHL player this past season, will be an AHL player this upcoming season as well, has kind of been jumped over on the Sharks depth charts by many players. At one point, maybe like 3-4 years ago, he was like a top 5 forward prospect for the San Jose Sharks, but those days have passed. That ship has sailed. So while Mike Grier is keeping him on the team, likely to just be some San Jose Barracuda help, his future with the San Jose Sharks probably doesn't really exist. But that will do it for this free agent update. Not a ton of surprises. Pretty much everything went exactly as one was expecting. The only sad part here is that Luke Kunin contract, but hopefully it doesn't actually end up being that big of a thorn in the Sharks' side, but I have a very sinking feeling that it will be. Class dismissed.